for countless generations, the galaxy told stories it no longer believed. They were the kind of stories civilizations kept only out of habit, passed from old tongues to young ears the way people pass embers through a long winter, not because they expected fire to matter again, but because something deep and ancient in them feared what might happen if it were ever allowed to die completely. The stories spoke of a species that had once walked the stars with impossible ambition, a species restless enough to cross voids that frightened wiser minds, a species violent enough to survive in a universe that punished softness, a species compassionate enough to feel shame for its own violence and dangerous enough to turn that shame into discipline instead of weakness. Most of the galaxy dismissed those stories with easy laughter. They called them relic myths from frightened ancestors who had needed monsters in the dark to explain the ruins they did not understand. In academy halls stretching across polished worlds, cadets smirked when instructors mentioned the old name. Scholars with long records and longer egos folded their hands and explained with patient certainty that the legends had been exaggerated beyond recognition. Merchants repeated the tales only as entertainment during long crossings between systems. Priests used them as metaphors. Politicians used them as jokes. Humans, they said, it was such a small word for something that, if the stories had been true, should have been far too large to disappear. That was one of the reasons the modern galaxy did not believe. Real things left evidence. Real empires left bones. Real powers left maps, fleets, ruins, descendants, debris fields, trade records, war archives. Humanity, according to accepted history, had left almost nothing that could be verified beyond fragments, anomalies, and contradictions that no two institutions could agree on. There were broken star charts that pointed toward impossible routes. There were weapon signatures buried in ancient battlefields that matched no known civilization. There were sealed records in forgotten vaults carrying redactions older than several living governments. There were planets with cities burned so completely that even their ash had become mystery. But mysteries, the great powers liked to say, were not proof. And so humanity became what the comfortable always reduce the inconvenient to in the end, a story on the shining capital of the Zur Confederacy, where towers of black glass rose over a world that had not known fear in centuries. Children learned the old legends the way children everywhere learned old legends, with delight rather than belief. They heard that humanity had once fought like creatures born with fire in their blood and ice in their thoughts. They heard that human fleets had crossed hostile sectors without surrendering speed. They heard that once, long ago, other empires had gone to war laughing and returned silent. The children enjoyed those parts most. Then they grew older, entered academies, put on uniforms, learned the statistics of modern power, and stopped laughing only long enough to become dismissive. In the Confederacy Naval Institute, where future commanders were shaped into instruments of certainty, instructors sometimes referenced the old myths to teach a lesson about psychological warfare. Fear, one lecturer had once said to a hall of young officers, is a weapon primitive civilizations use before they invent real ones. The so-called human myth is simply the oldest surviving example. The cadets had laughed obediently. At the back of the room, one old archivist had not. He had been invited only because no one else cared enough about ancient military folklore to do the lecture review. His eyes were dim, his shoulders bent, and his rank had long ago become ceremonial. He was the sort of man institutions keep around because removing him would require noticing him. He stood in silence until the laughter faded. Then he asked the class a question that ruined the mood with irritating efficiency. If humanity never existed, he said, why does every species tell the same story with different names? No one answered. The lecturer smiled with the indulgent cruelty of someone secure in majority opinion. Because fear travels well, he said. The archivist had nodded as though accepting that answer. But later, as the cadets filed out in groups, still amused, he spoke quietly to one young officer who lingered behind. Fear travels, the old man said. Yes, but so does memory. And memory does not survive across 10,000 years in 100 unrelated cultures without something feeding it. The cadet, eager and intelligent, and still too young to mistake certainty for wisdom, frowned. You think the stories are true? The archivist looked past him then, through the high glass of the academy toward the dark curve of the sky where warships moved like patient silver fish between orbital docks. I think, he said, the galaxy has confused absence with extinction. Those are not always the same thing. He left before the cadet could ask another question. That same conversation, in different forms, was happening all across the known stars. Not openly, never openly. Open belief in humanity was treated the way advanced civilizations treated prophecy, old curses, and obsolete gods, with embarrassed tolerance at best and contempt at worst. But in quiet places, where certainty loosened its collar, the whispers remained. On mining moons, where workers labored under contracts designed to outlive them, old laborers still muttered that one day the stars would change. On pilgrimage stations drifting above cold gas giants, certain monks read forbidden scraps of preserved text that described wanderers returning from silence at the turning of a great age. On border colonies, where patrol routes thinned and darkness pressed close beyond sensor range, parents still used a single sentence to calm frightened children when the power failed. Be still. If the old stories are true, they can hear fear. Most who spoke such words did not truly believe them, but belief was not always the point. Sometimes stories endured because they carried emotional truth long after factual certainty had eroded away. The galaxy lived beneath great powers that had made domination feel natural. The Zur Confederacy, largest among them, stretched across trade lanes and military corridors with the relaxed confidence of an empire that no longer remembered what real resistance looked like. Its fleets were too large, its governors too entrenched, its economy too central, its victories too numerous. It did not merely rule, it defined what rule meant, and that was exactly why the human stories never fully vanished. Because wherever power declares itself permanent, imagination begins searching for something larger. To the oppressed, humanity was not just an old terror, it was an old possibility. They spoke of humans not as saints, because the stories had never painted them that way. The legends did not say humanity was gentle. They said humanity was relentless. They said humans could be cruel in war, merciless when forced, frightening in their resolve. But the oldest and rarest versions of the stories included another detail the popular retellings often forgot. Humans hated chains, not only the kind wrapped around wrists. All chains, the chains of fear, the chains of submission, the chains of systems so old and vast that people stopped recognizing them as cages. On worlds where tribute fleets stripped harvests before local children had eaten, that part of the myth mattered. In prisons orbiting nameless stars, that part of the myth mattered. In hidden rooms where dissidents whispered over stolen power cells and watched the shadows under doors, that part mattered more than all the rest. Maybe the stories were false. Maybe humanity had died ages ago. Maybe Earth itself had turned to dust under a dead sun. But maybe not. Maybe somewhere beyond the charts approved by respectable governments, beyond the monitored routes and mapped sectors and the confidence of official history, something had survived, something patient, something that had not spent the long dark dying, something that had spent it remembering. In the deep archive vaults beneath Zur Prime, there were records the public had never seen, locked chambers of encoded material recovered from shattered probes, extinct civilizations, battlefield debris, and ancient wreckage. Most of it was incomplete, some of it was corrupted, much of it contradicted itself, but threaded through all of it, like a nerve through fossil stone, was a pattern no one liked to discuss. Warnings, not claims of conquest, not proclamations of divine right. Warnings, fragments of transmissions recovered from impossible distances and impossible ages, half-burned inscriptions cut into station walls, emergency logs from ships that had gone out strong and returned with crew complements measured in single digits. The phrasing changed, languages changed, context changed. The meaning did not. Turn back. Do not proceed. Leave this region. Do not force contact. In one sealed report so classified that only 9 living officials possessed clearance to read it in full, an unnamed analyst had written a conclusion that was never entered into public record. If even 3% of the surviving data is authentic, then the human phenomenon was not expansionist in the traditional imperial sense. Contact patterns suggest something more disciplined and potentially more dangerous, a power willing to remain absent until provoked, and devastating once forced to act. The analyst disappeared 6 days after filing the report. Officially, it was retirement. Unofficially, no one asked. Empires do not enjoy records that suggest there may once have been, or may one day again be, something they cannot bully into predictability. So the archives remained sealed, the myths remained mocked, and life across the Confederacy continued with the smooth arrogance of a machine too large to imagine interruption. Trade convoys crossed the inner lanes under naval escort. Tax barges lifted resources from outer colonies with mathematical efficiency. Governors rotated between worlds, each one inheriting the same assumption from the one before. Order was permanent because force was permanent, and force belonged to the Confederacy. Elsewhere, smaller powers adjusted themselves around that certainty. The Celt Dominion paid what it had to pay and called it diplomacy. The Vey Republic accepted inspection rights and called it regional necessity. Merchant guilds bribed patrol captains and called it operating cost. Entire species were born into the existing order and died believing it had always been this way. That was the true strength of empire. Not fleets, not weapons, not laws. Belief. The belief that no alternative had ever existed. The belief that no alternative ever would. That belief settled over the galaxy like dust over old ruins, thick enough to hide what lay beneath it. But dust is not stone, and buried things do not remain buried because they are weak. They remain buried because time has not finished with them yet. Beyond the trade maps, beyond the monitored frontiers, beyond sectors the Confederacy marked only with navigational hazard codes and dismissive notes about unstable signal clutter, there were regions ships avoided not because official doctrine forbade entry, but because crews did not like how their instruments behaved there. Signals echoed too long. Background radiation carried patterns no one could explain. Old software occasionally woke from dormant partitions and attempted to run translation routines against languages that should not have existed in current systems. Most captains filed such incidents as technical irregularities and moved on. A few did not. A few changed course without reporting why. A few stared too long into the dark and felt, with the cold certainty of instinct outrunning reason, that the silence on the far side of the stars was not empty at all. On one forgotten listening post, near the ragged edge of charted space, a night shift operator sat alone under dim panels and watched static crawl across her display. It was the kind of assignment careers went to die in, a post maintained because deleting it from the budget required more paperwork than keeping it alive. She had been half asleep, one hand under her chin, when a burst of signal rolled through the board and froze her in place. At first it looked like noise. Then the noise repeated. Then it repeated again, not randomly, but with spacing too measured to ignore. The operator straightened slowly. Something old stirred in the translation banks, not the active modern libraries. Deeper than that, dusty protocols she did not know the station still carried began to wake one by one, reaching downward through forgotten layers of archived language structures, searching, comparing, building. The lights on her console flickered. A line of untranslated symbols appeared. Then another. Then a third. The operator felt her mouth go dry, because she did not understand what she was seeing yet. But she understood, in the animal part of the mind that recognizes danger before thought has time to dress it in words, that the silence the galaxy had trusted for so long was beginning to answer back. The Zur Confederacy did not send its patrol fleet into the outer dark because it was afraid. That alone would have been unthinkable. Fear belonged to lesser powers, to border principalities and trade syndicates, and the little kingdoms that still mistook survival for strength. The Confederacy did not fear anomalies. It cataloged them. It did not fear resistance. It crushed it. It did not fear the unknown. It moved into it with banners raised and weapons hot, and made it known by force. So, when the first cluster of reports came in from the Terrace Expanse, no one at high command treated them as anything more than a minor irritation. Merchant vessels were hearing strange transmissions in dead space, beyond the official routes. Survey drones were returning incomplete telemetry full of corrupted packets and signal reflections that should not have existed in vacuum. Twice, military couriers passing near the sector reported abrupt sensor blackouts, followed by the brief appearance of encoded fragments that vanished before they could be archived properly. One captain, old enough to know better than to embellish his logs, included a note saying that his onboard translation banks had attempted to access a sealed linguistic archive without being commanded to do so. That report was laughed out of the review chamber. Systems glitched. Software decayed. Deep space radiation did strange things to old code. This was known. This was documented. This was ordinary. And yet the reports kept coming. Not many. That was what made them irritating rather than alarming. Just enough to inconvenience. Not enough to demand seriousness. A pattern too thin for panic. Too consistent for comfort. By the end of the cycle, enough bureaucratic friction had built around the issue that someone in the Upper Fleet Administration finally signed an order simply to clear the matter from the desk. Dispatch a patrol squadron. Investigate anomalous transmissions. Neutralize unauthorized activity. Reassert navigational authority in Sector Designation K-87, Terrace Expanse Perimeter. Routine language. Routine mission. Routine arrogance. The officer chosen to command it was Commander Ral Vane, a name spoken with that particular mix of admiration and relief institutions reserved for effective men they are grateful serve somewhere else. Vane had built his career on clean victories and decisive pressure. He had broken pirate strongholds in the Myrick Lanes, forced 3 colonial uprisings to surrender without letting any of them imagine negotiation had ever been possible, and once ended a 6-month insurgency in 12 days by targeting not the rebels' weapons, but their logistics, leadership relays, and sleep cycles. He was not subtle in personality, but he was precise in violence, and the Confederacy valued that more. He wore certainty the way other beings wore ceremonial armor. On the bridge of his flagship, he stood beneath tactical displays with his hands clasped behind his back and watched the last of the patrol vessels lock into formation around him. 10 warships in all, sleek and dark, and armed heavily enough to turn most regional navies into drifting salvage. More than enough, he had said, for smugglers playing games in restricted space. His executive officer, a careful woman named Terrell, who understood the value of silence around proud men, stood one pace to his right and reviewed the final departure clearances. Outer relay traffic has been advised to reroute, she said. Sector K 87 is now under temporary military restriction. Vane gave a small approving grunt. Good. No civilian clutter. The anomaly reports are loaded for your review. Summarize. Terrell glanced down at her pad. Unverified signal bursts, inconsistent origin points, transient sensor corruption, and one recurring encoded fragment that no active database has translated. Pirates, then. Possibly. He smiled faintly at that word. Possibly. He disliked hesitant language, but tolerated it from competent subordinates the way a duelist tolerates a practice blade. Not possibly, he said. Definitely. Someone found an old code structure and is using mythology to scare merchants off a route. Terrell did not answer. There was no benefit in pointing out that smugglers typically preferred routes worth taking, and K-87 sat beyond profitable lanes in a region known mostly for static bleed, dead rock, and nothing else. Vane had already decided what the mission was. Men like him often confused speed of judgment with strength of mind. The patrol fleet departed Zur Prime under a burn so smooth it scarcely seemed to disturb the velvet black around it. Engines glowed. Formation tightened. The capital world fell behind like a jeweled memory, and ahead lay the long, widening corridors of Imperial space. For the first half of the journey, everything behaved exactly as routine missions were meant to behave. Ship reports arrived on time. Sensors read clean. Communications were crisp. Crew tension stayed low, held in that pleasant zone between alertness and boredom familiar to professional warships sent somewhere they did not expect to bleed. On the secondary gunnery deck, junior officers joked about what they would find. Smugglers with antique signal toys. Cultists chasing ghost legends. Drifting station debris with a faulty broadcast loop. One young lieutenant, fresh from the academy and still carrying the polished confidence of theoretical excellence, asked if the strange message might turn out to be one of the old human warnings from the stories that earned the sort of laughter only military crews produce, quick and sharp and faintly cruel. Then I suppose, one weapons officer said, we'll have to apologize to the mythology department. Even the bridge crew smiled when the joke made its way upward. Only Terrell did not. She was not superstitious. She disliked superstition for the same reason she disliked sloppy accounting and unsecured ammunition. It created chaos where none was needed. But she had served long enough to distrust easy laughter in outer sectors. Space was too large for contempt to be a safe operating principle. By the third day, the edges of the known traffic web had thinned. Civilian signatures vanished from long-range screens. Beacon density dropped. The patrol entered a region where the stars seemed farther apart, not because they were, but because there were fewer artificial lights between them to trick the eye into intimacy. Even experienced spacers sometimes felt strange in such places. Civilization did not end all at once. It loosened, faded, and then was simply gone. The terrace expanse began, without ceremony. No border buoy, no marked divide, just a gradual degradation in the behavior of instruments. Passive scans came back, with slight delays, then contradictory echoes, then perfect readings that disagreed with active sweeps by margins too small to trust and too large to ignore. Background radiation fluctuated in repeating bands. Once, for less than a second, the flagship's external cameras dimmed and every display on the bridge showed a single black frame before returning to normal. The helmsman swore, quietly under his breath. Vane's expression hardened, though only slightly. Report. Minor sensor desync, Commander. Cause. Unknown. Compensating. Compensate faster. Yes, Commander. The fleet continued. The first signal reached them 4 hours later. Not through hailing channels. Not through open-band military frequencies. It appeared simultaneously across 3 unrelated systems. Long-range signal analysis, internal linguistic archive access, and the passive threat board, usually reserved for targeting anomalies. For one suspended second, the entire bridge seemed to pause around it. Rows of pale symbols scrolled across the central display, meaningless to the eye, but too structured to be dismissed as noise. Terrell stepped closer. "That is not random." "No," Vane said. "It is staged." He said it immediately, almost eagerly, like a man pleased to find reality cooperating with his assumptions. "Origin," he demanded. The sensor officer adjusted his array. "Negative fix. The signal is reflecting across the field. It may be bouncing through dust or debris, or being relayed." "Yes, Commander." "Can we jam it?" "We can suppress portions of the band, but it reappears shifted." Vane gave a soft snort. "Clever." The symbols vanished. Then, deep inside the fleet's system architecture, something woke. The translation engines did not activate because anyone had ordered them to. They activated because an ancient key buried in archival software had found a match it had been designed to recognize before most of the current cruise species had discovered stable jump corridors. Dust-covered partitions unsealed, obsolete lexicons spun up, forgotten protocols pushed aside modern systems with eerie authority, as though the ships themselves remembered something their operators had chosen to forget. The bridge lights seemed colder suddenly. The officers watched as the translation grid struggled, failed, recalibrated, then began assembling language with the slow care of an old machine opening its eyes. One word appeared, then another, then a complete line. "This is restricted space." The bridge went silent, not dramatically. No one gasped. No alarm screamed. Silence simply settled there all at once, heavy and specific, the way it does when a room full of trained people sees something none of them were prepared to see and understands that acknowledging it too quickly would make it more real. Then Vane laughed. It was a sharp sound, carefully shaped into contempt. "There it is," he said. "The trick." No one joined him this time. He did not seem to notice. An old archive, key wrapped around a threat display. Someone found a relic signal structure and built theater around it. Amateurish, but I'll give them credit for style. Terrell kept her eyes on the words. "Commander, that archive partition predates current Confederacy military language trees. So whoever sent this had access to something very old, or scavenged, or stolen, or copied from a wreck." He turned toward the comm station. "Open a response channel on all active bands." The officer hesitated only a fraction too long. "Commander, we do not yet have a fixed origin." "Then send it everywhere." The channel opened. Commander Ral Vane stepped forward into the center of his bridge, lifted his chin slightly, and spoke with the iron certainty of a man accustomed to the universe making room for his voice. "This is Commander Vane of the Zur Confederacy Patrol Fleet. You are transmitting inside sovereign military space. Identify yourselves immediately and prepare for boarding." The words went out clean and bright into the dark. Nothing answered. The silence that followed was somehow worse than static would have been. Not empty silence. Listening silence. The kind that made the skin along the neck tighten for reasons pride refused to explain. Vane's jaw shifted. Again. The comm officer repeated the transmission. Again nothing. Then every display on the bridge flickered once. The translated line disappeared. When it returned, it had changed. "This is human space. Turn back." For one long second, no one moved at all. The lieutenant at sensor control swallowed, so hard the sound carried across the bridge. Somewhere behind Terrell, someone whispered a word they likely regretted the instant it escaped them. Impossible. Vane did not turn toward the voice. He kept his gaze fixed on the screen, and for the first time since departure there was the slightest delay between what he saw and how he chose to feel about it. Not fear, not yet, but irritation stripped of ease. Then contempt rushed in to fill the gap. Human space, he repeated, almost gently, as if savoring the absurdity. Of course, a few of the officers managed weak smiles. They needed his certainty. Ships always did. Doubt moved through crews, faster than flame through oxygen. He turned to Terrell. You see, psychological theater. Whoever is behind this knows exactly which dead story still rattles old bones. Terrell did not answer quickly. That alone was dangerous. Commander, she said at last, permission to suggest we slow advance and conduct remote sweep before proceeding deeper. He looked at her as though she had briefly spoken in a language he did not respect. Because of a ghost story, because of an unknown signal source using command-level archive keys. It is a bluff. It may be. That answer displeased him more than open disagreement would have. He stepped back toward the tactical rail and rested both hands on it, staring into the layered darkness ahead where sensors showed only distortion, weak mineral scatter, and long regions of uncertain depth. A bluff only works, he said, if the target grants it emotional space. We do not. He lifted one finger. Maintain course. The helmsman obeyed. The patrol moved deeper. Minutes passed. Then the forward sensor net began reporting shadow mass. At first the readings looked like instrument drag, broad regions of density too dark and too clean to classify. The tactical officer adjusted gain, recalibrated angle, and frowned. The shapes remained. Not rocks, not gas, not debris clusters. Something with edges. Possible large objects ahead, she said. Define large. Still resolving. Resolve faster. The array swept again. This time the darkness changed shape. What had been one shadow became 3, then 6, then more, stretched across the black in a line so vast the mind resisted scale before the instruments confirmed it. The bridge lights reflected off widening eyes and suddenly motionless hands. One by one the ships ahead separated themselves from the void, not by bright engine burn or broadcast challenge, but by presence alone, like mountains emerging from fog. No insignia flashed, no ceremonial lights bloomed, no proud fleet anthem rolled across the comm. There were simply ships, long angular, silent, warships built without vanity. Every surface, every hard edge, every proportion carrying the same cold message. Function before beauty, battle before display, purpose before pride. The nearest sensor screen flooded with warning text. Unknown drive signature. Unknown power architecture. Unknown weapons configuration. Unknown hull composition. The young lieutenant at scans leaned closer, as if disbelief might sharpen the image. How many? Terrell asked. The tactical officer's voice came back thin and careful. I cannot confirm. Estimate. A pause. More than our initial sweep showed. Vane's face had become very still. Ahead, in the dark between stars, more shadows were appearing. The line was not a line at all. It was a wall. And somewhere inside the flagship systems, the ancient translator, awake now, fully awake, received one final transmission and rendered it with terrible calm across every major display on the bridge. This is human space. You have been warned. No one laughed. No one breathed loudly enough to hear. The patrol fleet kept moving for 3 more seconds, not because anyone meant it to, but because momentum has a way of surviving certainty by a heartbeat or 2. Then even that small inherited confidence began to die. For a moment that seemed to stretch beyond the useful limits of time, Commander Ral Vane did nothing. Not because he lacked orders, not because his bridge had become incapable of function, but because the thing hanging before his fleet in the dark had reached into him and touched something older than training, something older than rank, doctrine, prestige, or the long accumulation of victories that had taught him to mistake control for inevitability. He stood at the center of his bridge, with the warning still glowing across every display, and felt, with quiet and immediate hatred, that the universe had just shifted 1 degree away from obedience. It was an intolerable sensation. He crushed it at once. "Hold formation," he said. The words came out steady enough, not perfect, but steady enough for the crew to hear command instead of hesitation. That mattered. On warships, confidence was contagious, but so was the lack of it, and officers bled uncertainty downward faster than plasma ever could. Around him, stations came back to life. Fingers moved again. Consoles flashed. Sensor nets deepened their scans. Gunnery boards lit to standby amber. The crew seized gratefully on procedure, because procedure gave shape to fear and made it feel like work. Terrell kept her eyes forward. "Commander, the unknown vessels are maintaining distance. Because they want us to stop." "Yes." He allowed himself the ghost of a smile. "Then they are about to be disappointed." The tactical officer swallowed. Additional contacts emerging from shadowed sectors. "How many now?" "I cannot confirm exact count. Initial estimate 27. A beat. Revised estimate 43. Another beat. Revising again." No one asked the next number. They did not need to. The screen ahead was already answering for her as new silhouettes resolved 1 by 1 from what had first seemed like empty black. They had been there the whole time, engines at such minimal burn that they had merged with the dark itself, heat signatures masked, profiles broken by patient geometry and terrain. Not hiding in panic, waiting. That distinction worked into the bridge like poison. Vane refused it. He stepped forward until the central display cast pale light across his face and opened the command channel again, this time on a tighter directed band. "Unknown fleet," he said, voice sharpened into steel. "You are in violation of Confederacy authority and in possession of restricted archive code structures. Power down your systems and submit to inspection. Failure to comply will be interpreted as hostile intent." The reply came at once, not hurried, not angry, as though the answer had been ready long before the question. "You were instructed to turn back." The voice was human. That fact landed harder than the words, not because it sounded monstrous. It did not. It was level, almost quiet, carrying none of the distortion or ceremonial aggression that alien military broadcasts often employed to project dominance. There was no swelling rhetoric in it, no theatrical contempt, no roar of command. That calm was worse. "You are trespassing in human-controlled territory," the voice continued. "Leave now." A junior officer near the secondary scan pit made a small involuntary sound, not quite a gasp, and not quite a word. Others did not turn toward him, but everyone heard it. Everyone heard the voice. Everyone heard what it meant. Human, not myth, not prank, not salvaged signal theater. Human. Vane felt all of that pass through the bridge in a wave and hated the voice instantly for what it had done to his ship. Not damaged, not fired, not threatened. In any language he respected, and yet it had done something far more dangerous in that moment. It had made belief wobble. He set his jaw and answered with deliberate force. "This sector belongs to the Zur Confederacy." Silence. Then, no. Just that. No argument. No elaboration. No recognition that such a claim even deserved to exist beside reality. Vane's pride caught fire. There are many kinds of anger. Hot anger, stupid anger, frightened anger, performative anger. What rose in him then was colder than all of those. It came from the place where powerful men keep the assumption that the universe must eventually agree with them if they press hard enough. "Target the lead vessel," he said. Terrell turned to him fast. "Commander." He did not look at her. "We have not been fired upon," she said, low and urgent. "We are deep in uncertain territory against an unclassified force of unknown size. Recommend withdrawal to probe range and relay contact to High Command before escalating. He kept his eyes on the dark fleet ahead. Recommend. Yes. Denied. The bridge went very still again. Terrell took one step closer. Dangerous. Bold. Necessary. Commander, if this is what it appears to be, it is a bluff wrapped around old stories. Her voice dropped further. And if it is not, now he looked at her. The moment held. Everyone on the bridge felt it. Because the question had teeth, not loud teeth, real ones. If it is not, Vane's answer came like a blade drawn slowly from a sheath. Then High Command will need proof. He turned back to the tactical display. Lock the lead ship. The targeting officer obeyed, though his hands were not as steady as they had been an hour earlier. Thread by thread the flagship's systems reached out, painting solutions across the black, calculating intercept curves, velocity predictions, shield harmonics, hull stress points. Other patrol vessels fell into sync behind the flagship, their weapons boards aligning automatically through Confederacy Fleet Link doctrine. For the first time since entering the sector, the humans moved. Not forward, not aggressively. They shifted. The entire visible line adjusted with such precision that the eye almost failed to register movement at all. One ship angled a fraction starboard. Another dropped back. A third turned just enough to disappear behind the silhouette of a larger vessel. It was economical, nearly graceful, like a hand tightening very slightly around an unseen weapon. The sensor officer's voice came tight. They are changing formation. To attack. I don't know. Vane bared his teeth faintly. Then they're learning. The human voice returned, still maddeningly calm. This is your final warning. Vane lifted one hand. Fire. The patrol answered as one. Blue-white plasma bolts leapt from prow cannons in synchronized fury, screaming across the void in lines, so bright they turned the forward viewports into sheets of lightning. Torpedoes followed, their drives igniting in sharp controlled flares, curving toward human positions on preloaded attack solutions. Beam weapons lanced through the dark from the flanking ships, converging on the center of the human line with enough destructive force to erase pirate stations, crack orbital citadels, and pulp lesser fleets into vapor and metal fog. The bridge glowed with reflected violence. For one blazing instant it was beautiful, and for one blazing instant several officers believed, because this was the Zur Confederacy, because 10 warships firing in disciplined concentration was not an argument but a verdict, because nothing sane remained intact under that much precision fire. Then the screens cleared, and the human ships were no longer where the patrol had aimed. Not gone, moved. They had not scattered in panic or broken formation in desperate response. They had slipped. That was the only word for it. Slipped between targeting assumptions with impossible calm, sliding through the mathematical spaces where Vane's weapons had expected certainty to remain fixed. Plasma tore through emptiness. Torpedoes detonated against vacuum. Beam fire crossed open dark and burned nothing at all. The tactical officer stared, blinking too fast. No confirmed hits. Vane's head turned sharply. Impossible. Negative contact. They moved before impact. How? No one answered, because the honest answer would have been worse than ignorance. The human fleet had not merely reacted quickly. It had known. A second Confederacy volley fired before the first had fully died, this time spread wider, anticipating evasive patterns, boxing likely vectors, saturating the projected maneuver envelope. Again the human ships moved, smooth, unhurried, a fraction early every time, as though they were not dodging incoming fire so much as arriving ahead of it. The bridge displays filled with red miss indicators. No hits, no hits, no hits. On the third volley, one human ship broke from the line and cut across the face of the patrol formation at an angle so precise it seemed almost insulting. It did not rush. It glided. The black hull drank starlight, giving almost nothing back. Then a hard red lance flashed from its ventral spine. Just one beam. Thin. Tight. So controlled it looked less like artillery than decision. The nearest Confederacy cruiser took the strike dead across its center mass. For half a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the ship split open. Not exploded. Split. From bow to stern. Clean as if reality itself had been persuaded to separate the vessel into two embarrassed halves. Atmosphere vented in a glittering cloud. Fires bloomed along the exposed interior like sudden flowers of orange and white. Debris drifted out in terrible slow motion. Pieces of armor, scaffolding, bodies, lives. All of it carried soundlessly into the dark, while the two sections of the cruiser peeled away from each other with the dignity of a corpse falling apart in public. No one on the bridge moved. One of the younger officers whispered, "One shot." He had not meant to speak aloud, but shock had stolen discipline from him. "One shot," he said again, softer, like a man trying to understand language that had ceased behaving correctly. The patrol channel erupted. Status reports, damage screams, collision warnings from the dying cruiser's sister ship as it sheared hard to avoid the wreck. A captain from the rear flank barking for updated targeting data in a voice already climbing toward panic. Vane hit the comm mute with savage force. "Reform," he snapped. "Concentrate fire on their center line. Predictive spread pattern Theta 9. Flood the corridor." The tactical board updated. The human ships changed formation again. It should not have been possible for so many vessels to move with that little wasted motion. Confederacy doctrine linked ships through command relays. Yes, and its captains trained in formation combat from cadet years onward. But this was different. There were no visible lags, no micro-hesitations, no adjustment chatter, no evidence of ships obeying orders being issued and relayed and interpreted at all. They moved like pieces of one thought. That realization hit Terrell first, and when she spoke her voice had acquired the remote clarity of someone already stepping outside denial. "They're not coordinating like a fleet." Vane did not look at her. "Explain." "They are not responding ship by ship. They're shifting as a unified predictive body." The strategist at analysis caught it too. "Commander, they're minimizing profile exposure dynamically. Every time we establish a solution, the vulnerable angle is already gone." Vane's nostrils flared. "Then break the pattern." "We are trying." "Try harder." Another human beam flashed. A second Confederacy ship vanished into fire. This one did explode, but only after the initial strike drilled through its engine core with monstrous exactness. The blast expanded outward in a bright boiling sphere, swallowing escorts and peppering nearby hulls with molten fragments. Alarms began to strobe across the bridge now, not from direct damage to the flagship, but from fleet degradation, formation integrity loss, tactical confidence collapse, friendly fire risk rising as panicked ships widened firing arcs to catch ghosts already elsewhere. The human fleet remained silent. No taunts, no victory cries, no boastful transmission declaring superiority. That silence worked on the patrol more efficiently than any barrage could have. The Confederacy knew how to fight enemies driven by rage. It knew how to fight desperate holdouts and theatrical warlords and species that howled before charging. It did not know how to fight something that killed with the emotional temperature of a machine and the discipline of an old civilization that had settled every argument with itself before ever arriving here. A flanking destroyer broke formation without orders and surged forward. Captain, perhaps believing aggression might restore momentum where logic had failed. 3 human ships peeled off to meet it, not rushed, not excited. Their beams crossed once. The destroyer came apart in a spinning blossom of metal and white gas. The rest of the patrol saw it. Something invisible snapped. Voices flooded the command net again. No longer asking for targeting solutions, but for permission to reposition, permission to withdraw 3 degrees, permission to spread, permission to tighten, permission to do anything other than remain inside the shape of a losing battle. Vane let it roar for 2 seconds before opening the channel. Silence. The command tone still had power. Years of obedience do not vanish in a single minute. The flood quieted. "We are not being outgunned," he said. "We are being read. Change all firing sequences. Randomize timing. Break doctrinal alignment. Full independent attack variance." That earned him a few seconds of regained stillness. It was, in theory, the right response. If the enemy was predicting standardized Confederacy doctrine, then destroy the doctrine, introduce disorder, force uncertainty back into the battle. The order went out. Captains obeyed. Weapons fire fractured into staggered patterns. Across the black, each ship choosing its own timing, vector, interval, and angle. Chaos as defense. Improvisation as shield. The human fleet adapted in under 20 seconds. Not perfectly. That would have felt magical, and therefore easier for frightened minds to dismiss. No, they adapted visibly, practically, terrifyingly. A delayed roll here. A rotation there. A brief clustering of hulls around a vulnerable angle. Then a widening split that turned the patrol's own unpredictable fire into crossing lanes of wasted energy. They were learning as fast as the Confederacy was improvising, and unlike the patrol, they were learning without fear clouding the process. Terrell stared at the board. They only need to counter each pattern once. Vane heard her, understood her, hated her for being right, because that was exactly what was happening. Every new move the patrol attempted bought a few seconds of uncertainty. Then never again. The humans absorbed it, solved it, and the tactic died. A warning chime cut through the bridge. The flagship lurched as near-miss energy sheared across its outer shields, close enough to make the deck plates hum underfoot. Not a direct strike. A message. Someone on the damage board reported outer shield attenuation down 8%. The humans had finally targeted Vane's ship, not destroyed it, touched it. He felt that more sharply than the deaths of the others. The sensor officer's voice wavered. "Commander, additional contacts." Vane rounded on him. "From where?" "Behind us." The rear display bloomed. More human ships were emerging from darkness beyond the patrol's aft quarter, where empty space had sat unremarked seconds earlier. Not teleporting, not breaking physics, simply becoming visible as angles changed and masking positions were abandoned. "They were there the whole time," the officer whispered. Terrell didn't correct him. No one did. The patrol was no longer in a battle line. It was in a box. Vane saw it fully then. The initial wall ahead, the flanking drift, the new emergence behind, the way every attempted advance had carried his fleet exactly deeper into a geometry someone else had designed. The first engagement had not been contested. It had been shaped. His choices had not forced events into motion. They had revealed which trap he had chosen to spring. A sane man might have ordered withdrawal then. A wiser one certainly would have. But Vane was not sane in that useful, self-correcting way. He was proud, and pride under pressure often becomes more itself, not less. "All ships," he said, voice gone low and dangerous. "Spearhead formation. Forward thrust. Break the center." Terrell spun toward him. "Commander, no. Execute. They want us compressed. Execute." Across the fleet, battered ships obeyed through training and fear and the terrible inertia of command culture. The surviving patrol vessels tightened into a wedge and drove straight toward the apparent heart of the human line, engines burning hard now, every remaining weapon dumping fury into the narrowing corridor ahead. If they could punch through, Vane told himself. If they could break the formation, restore initiative, force close engagement, then numbers and aggression and sheer weight of Confederacy steel might still matter. For 3 seconds, it almost looked plausible. The human center held. Then it opened. Not broken. Opened. The wedge drove through into emptiness, momentum carrying the patrol forward into a hollow the humans had left for it with deliberate grace. The center reformed behind them. Flanks curved inward. Rear elements rose. The geometry completed itself around the Confederacy ships like a hand closing. The tactical display changed shape. Encirclement. Perfect encirclement. No officer announced it. No one needed to. The word sat in every skull at once. The crew of the flagship stared at their screens and saw the truth with a clarity so complete it was almost merciful. This had never been a fight for territory, never a border defense improvised in surprise, never a panicked response from a hidden remnant. It had been a demonstration, a lesson, a living answer to a question the galaxy had mocked for centuries. Are the myths real? Yes. And they are stronger than the stories were able to carry. The human voice came across the comm one last time. Not triumphant, not cruel, only certain. You were warned. Then the firing resumed. Not wild, not heavy for spectacle. Precise, patient, and final. One patrol ship died to the left. Engines punched into bloom and gone. Another lost propulsion and drifted, venting atmosphere like blood into water. A third vanished under intersecting beams that cut so cleanly the wreck held shape for a second before surrendering it. The bridge of the flagship shook as another near strike hammered the shields lower. Vane stood very straight, very still, and for the first time in his life, he understood with perfect clarity the difference between power and authority. Power makes others obey while you are present. Authority convinces them reality itself is on your side. The Confederacy had possessed the first for centuries. The humans had just arrived carrying the second. The first ship to die after the encirclement was not the weakest. That mattered. If the humans had chosen some damaged flanker limping on reduced shields, the remaining Confederacy crews might have lied to themselves for a few more precious seconds. They might have told each other the enemy was merely efficient, merely opportunistic, merely capitalizing on a battle already bending their way. But the humans did not choose weakness. They chose strength. The patrol's heaviest remaining cruiser, armored deep and carrying enough forward battery to break lesser fleets by itself, tried to pivot inside the tightening cage and bring its spinal cannons to bear. It managed half the turn. Then 3 human beams struck it in perfect sequence, one punching through shield harmonics, one tearing open the weapon's spine, and the last entering through the wound created by the first 2 and cutting the heart out of the ship with mathematical cruelty. The cruiser did not even get to die loudly. It shuddered once, vented white fire through 100 ruptures, and went dark so quickly it looked for a moment as if someone had simply erased it from the battle. No cheers sounded on the human channels, no celebration, only the quiet collapse of another impossible certainty. On the flagship bridge, Commander Ral Vane stared at the empty patch of tactical display where the cruiser had been and felt the battle slide fully beyond recovery. Not in numbers, not in firepower, in meaning. There are moments in war when defeat begins before casualties become fatal, moments when the surviving forces continue moving, firing, transmitting, obeying, and yet have already been defeated in the only place that truly matters, the place where they believe the future can still be forced into a familiar shape. That place was dead now. The Confederacy ships still fought, because ships are made of discipline long after hope has started. Leaking out of them, gunners tracked targets. Engines burned. Defensive screens rotated and strained. Damaged crews sealed ruptures and dragged the wounded clear of sparking systems. Captains shouted themselves hoarse over command bands, thick with static and overlapping panic. Procedure lived on, as it always did, but belief did not. The humans had taken that first. "Commander," Terrell said, and even her control was thinning now, worn sharp by the reality in front of them. "We need to disengage." Vane's eyes did not leave the display. "We are surrounded. Then break any vector available and run." He almost laughed at the word run, not because it was absurd, because it was accurate. Every pride he had ever worn rose in him against it. All those years of clean victories, crushed rebellions, submission reports signed with trembling hands by defeated governors, all the accumulated weight of being obeyed by the universe more often than not. And now here was truth, plain and humiliating, arriving on his own bridge in the voice of his own executive officer. Run. Around them the cage tightened. Human ships did not rush inward in a frenzy. They drifted closer, with the infuriating confidence of hunters who knew their prey had nowhere meaningful left to go. Their formation remained fluid even now, adjusting continuously, never presenting a stationary pattern long enough for reliable lock, never giving the patrol a single vulnerable point to attack with hope of consequence. The tactical officer slammed one palm against his console before catching himself. Their rotating shield exposures. Every time we concentrate on one vessel, another is already covering the angle. Then widen your spread. Vane snapped. We've widened, narrowed, randomized, staggered, and saturated. They keep compensating. A nearby lieutenant, too young to have sanded the fear out of his voice, spoke without waiting for permission. "It's like they know the result before we choose the move." No one rebuked him, because everyone on the bridge had begun to suspect the same thing. Not prophecy, not magic, something worse. Preparation, study, a species that had gone dark long enough to think. Another impact rippled through the flagship as a glancing human strike carved molten channels across the outer shield lattice. Warning sigils exploded across the forward board. Shield integrity down 12%. Port sensor cluster degraded. Heat bloom in the dorsal superstructure. Still, the humans did not target the command bridge directly. They could have. That knowledge settled over the crew like frost. If they had wanted Vane dead, he would already have been dead. Instead, they were peeling his fleet apart around him, forcing him to watch each piece fall, while preserving just enough of the flagship to carry the lesson home. The thought made bile rise behind his teeth. All ships, he barked over command channel, compress into defensive ring. Mutual cover arcs. Prioritize shield overlap. We cut our way out together. Fragments of confirmation answered him. Some immediate, some delayed. One or two missing entirely where destroyed vessels should have been speaking and were no longer capable of it. The surviving patrol ships obeyed, as best they could. Their new formation was ugly and desperate compared to the smooth authority of their original advance, but it had logic. Tighten the survivors. Layer shielding. Present concentrated return fire. Endure long enough to find one weak seam and burst through it with everything left. For a breath or two, it almost looked like order again. Then the humans changed shape. A dozen black warships slid outward from the encirclement, not in retreat, but in preparation, opening corridors through which smaller signatures suddenly flashed into existence. Fast attack craft, drone clusters, missile ghosts blooming from shadow and stone. Vane's bridge lit with new tracks so quickly the display lagged trying to render them all. "Interceptors," the sensor officer said, too softly. "No," said the strategist from analysis, horror creeping through each syllable. "Not interceptors. Screen breakers." The first wave struck the ring, not at the ships themselves, at the spaces between them. Human microtorpedoes punched into the narrow geometry of Confederacy shield overlap and detonated in carefully timed bursts, disrupting the synchronization the defensive ring depended upon. Gaps opened where there should have been none. Power load spiked. One patrol frigate took a full human beam through a momentary seam and vanished in a spray of incandescent wreckage before the rest of the ring even registered what had happened. "They're not overpowering our defense," Terrell said, realization cutting through her voice. "They're invalidating it." There was something almost obscene about the elegance of it. The Confederacy had built its warfare on dominance through scale. Strong hulls, heavy guns, imposing formations. Once it established pressure, lesser enemies folded. Once fear entered a battle, the Confederacy widened it until collapse followed naturally. This was how empires taught reality to smaller beings. The humans were doing the same thing now, only with intelligence instead of intimidation. Every system the patrol trusted, every doctrinal response centuries of victory had hardened into reflex. The humans treated not as obstacles, but as predictable architecture. Study the architecture. Find the load-bearing points. Remove them one at a time. Let the structure die under its own weight. Communications are degrading, the comm officer reported. Cross-ship packet loss rising. "I'm getting duplicate order echoes." Vane rounded. "Why?" The officer hesitated. That was answer enough. Terrell said it aloud. "They're inside our channels." The bridge went colder somehow. "What?" "Not jamming," she said. "Reading. Maybe redirecting. They're anticipating command updates before they complete." Vane stared at her, as if daring the idea to be false. But on the tactical screen, the proof was already moving. A destroyer on their starboard edge attempted to pivot and reinforce the damaged section of the ring. 2 human ships intercepted the vector before the order could possibly have propagated through normal analysis time. Another cruiser throttled engines for a break attempt along the lower plane. A spread of human fire met it exactly at the point where its evasive curve would peak. A support ship tried to fall back and redistribute power to long-range batteries. A hidden beam from somewhere behind an asteroid cluster pierced its reactor block before redistribution completed. Every command, every adaptation, answered before it finished becoming action. The crews understood. Their enemy was not merely faster. Their enemy was listening. Across the fleet, discipline began to fray. The Confederacy was too professionally built for that. Years of service still mattered. Training still mattered. Fear did not erase muscle memory or duty with a single breath. But the cracks spread visibly now. One ship broke formation without orders and ran hard for open dark, only to be crippled by 3 intersecting strikes and left tumbling, engines bleeding plasma. Another refused a repositioning order, its captain shouting over the channel that holding current orientation gave a better shield profile, and then cutting transmission entirely. A third began transmitting damage reports so rapidly and repeatedly that it drowned out command traffic around it until the signal went dead mid-sentence. Vane opened his mouth to restore order. A human shot hit the flagship. Not a graze, not a warning touch, a real strike. It sheared across the port quarter, overwhelming the weakened shield band and carving into the outer hull with enough force to throw the bridge crew sideways. Consoles spat sparks. One forward screen died in a burst of black. The deck pitched under Vane's boots, and for the first time in many years he grabbed the command rail to keep from falling. Alarms screamed. Damage control shouted from 3 sections at once. Port quarter breach. Secondary power conduit severed. Fire in dorsal access. Shield integrity down to 42%. The bridge filled with smoke and acrid metal stink. Somewhere to the rear, a crewman cried out once, and then no more. Vane hauled himself upright and stared through the failing screen where the human fleet still hung in disciplined silence around the wreck of his certainty. He had been touched now, marked, given no excuse left at all. Terrell wiped blood from the side of her face with the back of one hand and leaned toward him through the flashing red light. "Commander, order retreat." He heard in her voice not disrespect, not panic, but the final exhaustion of someone who had finished spending faith. He looked around his bridge, at the officers trying to breathe evenly through smoke, at the tactical displays crowded now with wreckage and dead transponders, at the names vanishing from the fleet roster one after another, at the humans who could have ended this faster and had chosen not to. That, more than anything, broke something in him. Not mercy, control. The knowledge that this was not battle in the form he understood. It was curation. The humans were shaping how much of his fleet survived, how much terror escaped, how much proof returned to the worlds that had laughed at the old stories. They were not just winning. They were authoring what victory would mean. His throat felt lined with ash. "All ships," he said. The command net answered with static, broken confirmations, weeping metal, voices he recognized and voices he did not. One captain openly sobbing while trying to deliver a systems report in military cadence. "All ships," Vane repeated, louder now, forcing the words into shape. "Retreat. Disengage immediately. Break contact on any vector. Repeat, break contact." No one said the obvious thing, that it was too late for most of them. But his order had still changed the battle, if only in tone. The surviving patrol ships stopped trying to impose meaning on the engagement and began trying only to survive it. Engines flared in ragged sequence. Ships rolled, dove scattered, burning hard for whatever darkness looked least occupied by human guns. The defensive ring dissolved into fragments and fleeing metal. The humans let it happen. Not completely, not kindly. A rear escort that delayed 2 seconds, too long lost its stern half to a beam strike that turned its engine room into daylight. Another ship managed almost 1,000 kilometers of retreat before hidden fire from above the ecliptic punctured its core and sent it spinning dark. A third was stripped of weapons and drive rather than destroyed, left drifting dead in the void like a lesson pinned to a board. But the rest, those few ragged survivors the humans judged useful, were permitted a path through wreckage, silence, and unbearable understanding. The flagship staggered into it with scorched armor, failing shields, and half its port batteries gone. Around it stumbled what remained of the patrol, not a squadron now, but a collection of wounded testimonies dragging themselves toward the edge of the sector. Vane stood on his bridge amid smoke and ruin and waited for pursuit. It never came. The human fleet stopped at the boundary of its chosen geometry and held there, dark ships motionless against the stars, watchful and absolute. They did not chase. They did not gloat. They did not fill the retreat corridor with triumphant threats. They simply watched. The effect was worse than pursuit would have been. Had they chased, Vane could have called them blooded predators and hated them cleanly. Had they raged, he could have found comfort in the familiar shape of violent enemies. But this stillness, this refusal to spend more energy than necessary, this disciplined acceptance that the point had already been made, it forced him to understand the hierarchy between them in a way no further casualties could have improved. A final transmission arrived as the patrol crossed back toward the outer dark. It appeared on every surviving bridge, every damaged screen, every emergency board still capable of language. "We exist. Remember what you saw." No signature followed. No title. No demand for surrender or tribute. Only truth. Vane read the words and felt the last internal defense collapse, not because he finally believed in humans. Belief was too small a word now. He had fought them. He had heard their voice. He had watched his fleet burn under weapons that moved like thought. He had seen discipline so complete it felt older than arrogance itself. This was no myth returning to claim vindication. This was reality, correcting a lie that had lasted too long. Behind the flagship, wreckage turned slowly in the black, lit by distant starlight, and the fading fires of dead Confederacy ships. Ahead lay Imperial space, command chambers, councils, admirals, archives, all the polished machinery of a civilization built on the assumption that force at scale was the highest law in existence. Vane understood, with a nausea deeper than fear, that he was carrying back more than damage. He was carrying infection, proof, and proof was far more dangerous to an empire than defeat. As the crippled patrol limped out of the terrace expanse, emergency signals scattering ahead of it across relay chains and military lanes, rumors outran the fleet by hours. Fragments of transmission leaked. Distress codes were misread and reread. The word human appeared first in secure traffic, then restricted traffic, then traffic too urgent to remain restricted. By the time the surviving ships crossed into uncontested Confederacy space, whispers were already moving through command structures that had not whispered in generations. The myths are real. At the edge stations, officers reading the first broken reports frowned in irritation, then concern, then something colder. At relay hubs, signal clerks quietly copied message strings before forwarding them upward. On patrol routes far from the battle, captains slowed their ships without admitting why. At naval academies, instructors who had spent careers teaching certainty suddenly found old jokes sitting badly in their throats. And still the flagship came on, burned, broken, silent where it should have been proud. When it finally entered the outer military dock at Zur Prime, the watching crews did not cheer its return. They stared, not at the hull damage alone, though there was enough of it to silence any room. Not at the gaps in formation where missing ships should have been, though those absences yawned like open graves. They stared at the survivors, at the officers walking off those ships with faces that no longer matched the men and women who had left, at the way battle-trained personnel flinched, almost imperceptibly, whenever station lights dimmed or a distant hull groan echoed through the docking spine, at the way no one laughed when the first dockworker, forgetting caution, asked in a hushed voice what had happened out there. Commander Ral Vane did not answer him. He kept walking toward the transport that would take him to the High Council chamber. His uniform was scorched. One side of his collar was missing. There was dried blood beneath one ear. He had not slept since the battle began, but exhaustion had gone beyond usefulness and hardened into something like stone. By the time he entered the council hall, every seat was filled. Admirals, governors, ministers, strategists, all the living architecture of Confederacy supremacy gathered beneath cold light and carved emblems, waiting to hear the patrol commander explain why 10 warships had gone into the dark and returned as wreckage and rumor. Vane stood before them, and for the first time in his career understood that no arrangement of rank, ritual, or architecture could make this room stronger than the truth he carried inside it. The chamber asked for his report. He gave it in 3 sentences. The myths are real. The humans have returned, and we were never in control of that battle. The silence afterward was deeper than shock. It was the sound a civilization makes when the future arrives wearing the face of something it had chosen to call impossible. The report did not remain inside the High Council chamber for long. That was the first sign the Confederacy was already weaker than it claimed. Strong empires keep humiliations contained. They compress failure into sealed archives, rename catastrophe as tactical complication, and bury the names of the dead beneath polished language until the public can no longer tell whether anything meaningful was ever lost. They do this not merely to protect morale, but to preserve the single illusion upon which all imperial order depends, that power remains coherent even when it bleeds. But coherence had already begun to fail. Too many officers had heard the word before it was classified. Too many relay clerks had copied fragments before the security locks descended. Too many dockworkers had seen the state of the returning ships. Too many wounded survivors had stepped into triage bays with the look of beings who had seen something larger than doctrine and come back altered by it. So the truth escaped, not complete truth. Empires are rarely undone by complete truth at first. It escaped as rumor, broken and uneven and multiplying as it moved. A destroyed patrol beyond the terrace expanse. Unknown warships. Ancient signal structures. A fleet that moved without error. A commander returning silent. A classified name spoken aloud in military traffic after centuries of academic ridicule. Human. On Zur Prime. The word spread first through the lower administrative arteries of the capital, through maintenance shafts and office corridors, and the thousands of invisible conversations that keep great systems alive beneath their own self-importance. Junior analysts pretended to organize logistics while reading leaked fragments on hidden slates. Messengers moved sealed packets between ministries and passed whispered interpretations in doorways. Naval cadets, forbidden from discussing active frontier matters, discussed nothing else. In tower cafeterias, where officials had once spoken carelessly about tariffs, appointments, and ceremonial fleet reviews, entire tables fell quiet when someone murmured the old name. The first public networks dismissed it with predictable contempt. Conspiracy chatter, they called it. Border hysteria. A smuggler fabrication. A ghost story scavenged from a damaged patrol report. Commentators smiled the careful, superior smiles of people who make careers out of sounding unworried on cue. Retired admirals appeared on state panels and reminded viewers that frontier incidents were often exaggerated by frightened captains who mistook bad sensor conditions for strategic significance. Professional scholars with perfect robes and polished credentials informed audiences that humanity was a composite myth, a narrative residue from several extinct cultures improperly merged by folklore over time. And for a few hours that worked. Not because the explanations were good, because they were familiar. Familiarity is a sedative stronger than evidence in civilizations that have gone too long without genuine challenge. The average citizen of the Confederacy had lived an entire life inside a machine so large and stable it felt less like government than weather. Patrols went out, trade came in, taxes were collected, distant rebellions were suppressed, statistics remained favorable, the stars turned, the Zur banner endured. That rhythm had lasted longer than memory on some worlds. It took more than one ugly report to convince people the universe had changed. Then the doc footage leaked. No one ever proved who released it. Some said a medic did it after treating survivors who shook in their sleep and whispered about black ships moving like thoughts in the dark. Some said a junior logistics officer copied the internal feeds because he could not bear hearing senior officials call the incident exaggerated. Some said it came from the military itself, from a faction already positioning for internal blame. It did not matter. What mattered was that suddenly millions of citizens across Confederacy space saw, with their own eyes, the flagship of Commander Ral Vane entering port as something that no victorious vessel had ever resembled. The hull was torn open along the port quarter. Whole weapon arrays were gone. Armor plates had been melted into grotesque frozen ripples. Escort positions around it stood empty, where ships should have been, and the crews disembarking did not look like soldiers returning from a manageable border action. They looked like witnesses. The laughter ended there, on the great trade world of Avel, where markets ran day and night beneath layered domes bright as artificial dawn. Transactions slowed for the first time in living commercial memory. Merchants stopped mid-negotiation to pull fresh feeds onto pricing screens. Brokers who had spent careers treating war as an abstraction affecting insurance margins watched military analysts pause too long before answering simple questions and felt their stomachs tighten. Trade guild representatives gathered in private conference rooms and began, in carefully neutral language, reviewing the security assumptions that underpinned 3 sectors' worth of shipping contracts. No one said panic. Profitable people rarely do. But whole fortunes began changing direction that day. Insurance multipliers shifted. Risk models widened. Quiet requests went out for private escorts along lanes that had not required them in decades. And beneath all the technical language, beneath every spreadsheet, assessment, and revised transport corridor, lay the same unspoken thought. If the Confederacy can be struck, then nothing priced on its invincibility is truly stable. On the mining moons of Callus, where workers lived in pressurized barracks carved into old industrial rock and measured life in shifts rather than years, the news moved differently. There were no polished state panels there, no elegant pundits smoothing fear into talking points. The miners received fragments, salvaged transmissions, copied internal bulletins, half-trusted rumors repeated over meal trays and oxygen filters. But rough truth often survives better in hard places than refined lies do. By the end of the cycle, crews on half a dozen extraction sites had stopped working for almost 12 minutes at the same time. 12 minutes was not long by the standards of revolution. It was an eternity by the standards of regulated labor. Foremen shouted. Supervisors issued fines. Systems flashed compliance warnings. Still the workers sat where they were, grease on their hands and dust in their lungs, looking up at the dim overhead lamps as though they might somehow reveal a different sky. One old excavator operator, a woman whose contract had outlived 2 husbands and 1 son, laughed under her breath when the rumor reached her drill line. "Humans," she said. A younger worker snorted. "You don't believe that." The old woman looked at him for a long second, her face unreadable beneath coal-black streaks. "No," she said. "I believe in empires saying impossible until impossible arrives with guns." That line traveled through the moon colonies almost as fast as the original rumor. On the temple world of Cell, where the air smelled of incense and old stone, and the Confederacy usually tolerated theology only so long as it remained politically decorative, priests descended into sealed archives that had not been opened in years. Sacred attendants in gray and gold carried ancient text cylinders into the light and read passages once treated as ceremonial metaphor. The wanderers will return from silence. The forgotten fire will cross the dark again. The turning of the great age. Those who made cruelty law will learn that law is not the same as permanence. High clergy, who had preached obedience as cosmic order, stood before those lines with trembling lips and discovered that prophecy, when it aligns with military reports, acquires a dangerous new weight. Pilgrims filled the outer courts by evening. Candles burned. Questions spread. For the first time in generations, worship on Cell turned from gratitude to anticipation. And anticipation is a form of power. In the central military academies, where doctrine had once worn the smooth confidence of proven inevitability, old curriculum modules were quietly pulled for review. Historical lectures that mocked the human myth were suspended, pending archival clarification. Cadets noticed. Cadets always notice when authority changes tone before it changes language. Small jokes stopped appearing in common rooms. Instructors who had sneered openly at ancient warnings now spoke of unverified legacy contact phenomena and possible hostile remnant actors operating beyond the charted edge. No one believed the euphemisms, least of all the cadets, for young officers raised to think command naturally belonged to the Confederacy. The patrol defeat created a fracture more intimate than public fear. It broke educational continuity. Everything they had been taught about strategic hierarchy suddenly had an asterisk burning beside it. Most adapted by growing louder. A few adapted by growing quiet. The quiet ones were more dangerous in the long term. On the oppressed outer worlds, where Confederacy rule was not abstract administration but visible extraction, visible humiliation, visible force, the rumor became something else entirely. Hope. not loud at first. Hope rarely is. It appeared in glances that in pauses that and the dangerous stillness that enters a room when people who have spent years agreeing on their helplessness begin, all at once, to suspect helplessness may have been exaggerated. On Darren, a tribute world that had not kept enough of its own harvest in 23 years to feed its children through winter without ration collapses, dock laborers unloading imperial grain tariffs began passing a single phrase between them beneath the noise of the cranes. They can bleed. No speeches. No banners. Just that. They can bleed. On a prison moon circling a dead star in the southern extraction belt, inmates heard through bribed guards that an entire Confederacy patrol had run from something in the outer dark. Men and women who had not smiled in years smiled then, not from joy exactly, but from recognition, the kind that comes when pain finally receives confirmation that it is not permanent law. On slave worlds, where whole populations had been conditioned to think of themselves not as peoples, but as assets with names attached for convenience, the whispers changed rhythm. They became sharper, more frequent, more dangerous. Overseers noticed productivity drops they could not explain. Small acts of defiance multiplied. Eye contact lasted longer than it should have. Silence, after commands, acquired a different quality. The Confederacy heard all of this and feared it more than the battle itself, because military defeat can be avenged. Belief, once loosened, is much harder to rechain. Inside the Capitol, the High Council met again and again, each session more crowded than the last, each one thick with the smell of expensive fear. Admirals demanded numbers. Ministers demanded containment. Governors demanded reassurance. Intelligence directors demanded time they did not have. Around the central chamber table, voices rose and fractured into overlapping claims, denials, accusations. "It was one patrol," snapped one senior admiral, claws drumming hard against the polished stone. "An isolated disaster in anomalous terrain. We have crushed stronger enemies with larger formations." "No," said another, one of the few to have spoken directly to returning survivors. "We have crushed enemies we understood. That is not the same thing." A governor from the inner systems leaned forward, rings gleaming on all four hands. "Public comm is deteriorating. Commercial trust is already showing volatility. We need a statement. We need a victory," one minister said. That line hung in the chamber, because everyone understood it was true. The Confederacy could survive casualties. IT could survive embarrassment. IT could even survive uncertainty for a short span, if carefully managed. What it could not survive was a galaxy-wide perception that its power might be contested by something older, stranger, and stronger than itself. Everything the Confederacy was rested on the belief that resistance was futile in the long run. Trade agreements, tax compliance, military deterrence, colonial obedience, religious accommodation, even neutral diplomacy with independent powers. All of it depended on one emotional truth more than any legal doctrine. The Confederacy cannot be meaningfully challenged. Now that truth had a wound in it, and everyone in the room knew wounds spread. The High Chancellor listened to the arguments without interruption. She was older than most of the machinery around her, older in mind if not in body, and unlike many who served under her, she had not mistaken longevity for immortality. She had watched annexations, famines, insurgencies, succession panics, market collapses, and the long patient work by which empires convince themselves that each crisis survived proves they are unbreakable rather than merely not yet broken. When the room finally exhausted itself into silence, she spoke. "Tell me," she said, and the quiet that followed her voice was immediate, "what exactly we know. Not what they wanted, not what they assumed, not what would be politically useful. What they knew." The answer, when assembled, was uglier than anyone preferred. A patrol of 10 warships had entered the terrace expanse. IT had encountered a fleet identifying itself as human. IT had been warned repeatedly to withdraw. IT had engaged. IT had been comprehensively outmatched. The enemy possessed technology and tactical integration beyond any current Confederacy profile. The enemy had spared survivors intentionally, and the name human was now spreading through civilian, military, religious, and commercial channels faster than censorship protocols could contain. The Chancellor sat very still through all of it. Then she asked the only question that mattered. "If the reports are true," she said, "what do they want?" No one answered immediately, because power understands conquest. Power understands tribute, revenge, territorial hunger, resource hunger, prestige hunger. Power understands other powers best when they resemble itself. But this was less comfortable. The humans had not invaded. They had not pursued the retreat. They had not issued demands. They had not appeared on public channels promising annihilation. They had simply won, and then they had allowed the truth of that victory to spread, that suggested intent of a more unsettling kind, not hunger, calculation. On the outskirts of the chamber, an intelligence minister cleared his throat. "We are redirecting all assets," he said. "Signal analysis, frontier reconnaissance, deep archive review, deniable probes. We will determine origin, scale, and likely objective." The Chancellor nodded once. "Do so." Another admiral leaned forward. "And in the meantime..." Now she looked around the room, at the governors whose confidence had already begun curdling into self-preservation. The admirals who wanted a war large enough to erase humiliation. The ministers thinking about markets, revolts, coalitions, and blame. "In the meantime," she said, "we do not mock what has already destroyed one of our fleets." No one spoke after that, because beneath all the politics, all the rhetoric, all the instinctive grasping for old certainty, another realization was beginning to spread among the ruling class with the same relentless speed the rumor had spread among workers and prisoners and priests. This was not only a military problem, it was a narrative collapse. For centuries, the Confederacy had ruled not just through ships and tribute, but through the story it told the galaxy about itself. The story said power belonged to the disciplined strong. The story said history had already selected its winners. The story said rebellion was childish, hope was expensive, and resistance only delayed the inevitable. Then a fleet out of old myth had appeared from the dark, broken a patrol without visible strain, and left enough survivors alive to carry the contradiction home. That contradiction was now moving through the stars, through markets and mines, through temples and academies, through slave camps and diplomatic channels, through boardrooms and docking bays and whispered conversations beneath surveillance drones. 1,000 civilizations, classes, and castes were hearing the same thing in different words. The order of things is not permanent, and once a population begins to suspect that, history becomes much more difficult to govern. The Confederacy did what empires always do when humiliation cuts too deep to survive as memory alone. It prepared something enormous and called it wisdom. Publicly, the language was measured. The state channels spoke of a necessary stabilization response, of reinforced frontier security, of a coordinated operation to restore confidence in the outer sectors. Elegant officials stood beneath the Zur banners and used phrases like regional containment, navigational assurance, and defensive realignment. They wore expressions designed to reassure populations that still wanted reassurance badly enough to mistake polished lies for structure. Privately, no one in power used those words. Privately, they called it what it was: the final campaign fleet. The name carried the exact flavor of frightened grandeur. Too dramatic for confidence, too ceremonious for calm. It was the name civilizations choose when they need history to feel scripted in their favor before history has agreed to cooperate. Across 100 worlds, shipyards woke to round-the-clock burn schedules. Orbital assembly rings that had once rotated on measured commercial timetables abandoned the concept of shifts entirely. Construction lights blazed without pause. Stored warships were dragged from reserve vaults and refitted in frantic succession, their hulls still carrying dust from decades of strategic neglect. Experimental weapon platforms that had languished in research files under the label "not yet necessary" were pulled into immediate production with the rough violence of panic disguised as urgency. Freighters stopped carrying luxury goods and carried munitions. Instead, refineries changed allocation priorities overnight. Civilian traffic was bumped, rerouted, delayed, or seized outright in the name of emergency provisioning. Conscription quotas quietly widened on the outer worlds because the lives spent there had always counted as the cheapest fuel in the imperial system. The galaxy watched, some with fear, some with grim satisfaction, some with the silent, hungry attention of powers waiting to see whether the Confederacy's wounded pride would restore its authority or finish destroying it. On Zur Prime, the High Chancellor signed each mobilization order with a hand that never visibly shook. Those close enough to read the strain in her eyes understood that she no longer believed in the story her admirals were telling the public, but she understood something equally dangerous. The Confederacy could not stop now. It had already been seen bleeding. If it failed to answer that wound with scale, then every tribute world, every restive governor, every neighboring power, every smuggler prince and religious dissident and commercial opportunist across the stars would read restraint not as prudence, but as weakness. The Empire had built itself too completely on spectacle and inevitability to survive a moment like this through patience. Pride had become structural, and structural flaws are the ones that collapse entire civilizations when pressure arrives. So the fleet assembled. 2,000 warships. That was the number repeated through every military corridor until it began to sound less like arithmetic and more like prayer. 2,000. An ocean of steel and plasma and armor, spread across layered formations that blocked starlight when they massed for departure. Carrier groups, siege cruisers, destroyer lances, electronic warfare screens, supply tenders, mobile command citadels, mine layers, boarding platforms, heavy artillery barges, interceptor clouds nested inside launch cradles like swarms of sleeping teeth. It was a fleet designed not merely to win, but to be seen winning. Every doctrine the Confederacy trusted had gone into its shape: depth, redundancy, overlapping fire lanes, command relays, compartmentalized tactical clusters, numerical pressure at scales that had historically broken resistance long before perfect execution became necessary. The admirals walked those decks feeling the old confidence, trying to reassemble itself around sheer mass. Numbers had always comforted empires. Numbers made abstract fear feel manageable. One patrol lost in strange terrain was humiliation. 2,000 warships was correction. That was the theory. And because frightened institutions always seek mathematics when they have lost emotional control, the theory spread quickly through command culture. Quality has limits, the admirals told one another. Coordination has limits. Mystery has limits. Everything has limits when enough steel arrives. 2,000 defeats, 300 point. 2,000 defeats, 500 point. 2,000 defeats, whatever those things in the dark turn out to be. The officers repeated the numbers. The crews repeated the numbers. The public repeated the numbers too, because people love ratios when they are desperate for certainty. Across the frontier, ships of the final campaign fleet moved toward the outer dark in layered procession, their drives burning bright enough to paint entire sectors in reflected fire. State channels followed them with reverent commentary. Public morale broadcasts swelled with martial music and historical montages. Old victories were replayed. The patrol disaster was reframed as unfortunate reconnaissance loss preceding rightful Imperial response. And still, beneath all of it, the fear remained. Because numbers comfort best when the enemy can be understood in the same language. The humans had shown no interest in that language at all, deep in the outer sectors. Beyond the regions where public maps still bothered pretending accuracy, the Terran commanders watched the Armada's approach with neither surprise nor visible urgency. They had intended this. That was the part the Confederacy never grasped until too late. The patrol battle had not been merely defense. It had been invitation, not to diplomacy, not to negotiation, to concentration. Every trace the humans had allowed to escape afterward had been shaped with patient intent. The repeated signal echoes detected by frontier posts, the carefully incomplete decryptions, the patrol sightings that grew just clear enough to panic, then went dark, the rumors of command transmissions heard in asteroid shadow, the false confidence embedded in the apparent fleet distribution. Every clue the Confederacy gathered after its humiliation, every discovery, its intelligence services congratulated themselves for extracting from the dark, had been calibrated to produce one outcome. Bring everything. Bring all of it. Bring your pride, your mass, your command structure, your dependence on coordination, your belief that concentration of force solves what concentration of force created. Bring the largest fleet you can imagine. Bring it where we choose. The place chosen was the Kale Rift. Even by frontier standards, it was an ugly region. The remains of moons shattered in some cataclysm. So ancient no living archive agreed on its origin drifted there in impossible geometry. Whole asteroid fields tangled with debris belts, mineral shadows, ion storms, broken gravity gradients, and long corridors of sensor interference. Distances lied in the rift. Depth lied. Empty space often turned out to contain rock, and rock often turned out to contain nothing where instruments swore mass should be. No fleet that depended on clean sight lines and stable coordination should ever have wanted battle there, which was precisely why the Confederacy could be made to choose it. The intelligence reports had framed the rift as a hiding place, a remnant nest, a defensive refuge for a smaller fleet, relying on terrain to compensate for inferiority. The Confederacy's admirals looked at those reports and saw what proud minds always see when they are desperate to restore dignity: a chance to corner, a chance to overwhelm, a chance to make the enemy's caution look like weakness. The final campaign fleet entered the Kale Rift under full battle readiness. Thousands of hulls moved in deliberate sequence between drifting rock masses older than most governments. Formation lights flashed across the broken stone. Long-range weapons armed. Screening corvettes pushed outward. Sensor ghosts multiplied and were dismissed. Mine risk estimates were logged and acknowledged. Tactical commanders flexed their attack clusters into position and watched the numbers settle in their favor until anxiety began, at last, to resemble confidence. The lead admiral, Sarat Val, stood on the bridge of the command Citadel Resolute Crown and looked out over the layered tactical projection with the hard relief of a man who believed he had finally restored war to familiar proportions. 300 confirmed, said the sensor chief. Then, after another sweep, perhaps fewer. A murmur ran through the bridge. Relief loves to disguise itself as contempt. 300, Val repeated. Against this. He let the words hang while the display rendered the full Confederacy mass in luminous tiers around the shadowed heart of the rift. 2,000 ships in coordinated depth, enough firepower to turn asteroid belts into dust and lesser civilizations into memory. The crews across the fleet saw the same count, 300. The number spread in seconds from bridge to bridge, compartment to compartment, whispered first, then spoken with broadening confidence The humans had seemed invincible when they were half-seen shapes in patient dark, when their scale was uncertain and their methods unmeasured. But 300 was a quantity. 300 was finite. 300 was killable. On the command citadel, Admiral Vol smiled for the first time in days. "The myths die here," he said. No answer came from the humans. That, more than any threat, should have warned them. There were ships in the dark. Yes. Human warships sliding from asteroid shadow and the cold backs of drifting stone, taking shape one by one under Confederacy scans. Hard black hulls. Minimal engine flare. No ornamental light. No heraldry worth mentioning. No visible concern. They gathered in disciplined silence beneath the broken moons, like pieces of a thought assembling itself. Still no answer. No taunts.no demands.no theater. Only formation. The shapes changed as they assembled, not holding still in lines familiar to Confederacy doctrine, but flowing from triangles into spirals, spirals into wedges, wedges into dispersed hunter lattices that rewrote their own geometry before analysis programs could classify what they had just seen. Human formations did not simply move. They evolved in real time, as though their battle language had been built to resist prediction by cultures that depended on naming patterns before countering them. The Confederacy officers noticed. Then they dismissed it, because numbers were back on their side, and numbers soothe embarrassment into stupidity faster than almost anything else. "Forward batteries," Vol ordered. "Open the engagement." The Kale Rift became light. 2,000 warships answered with everything Imperial industry could make terrible. Plasma storms crossed the void in layered arcs bright enough to cast shattered moons into stark relief. Torpedoes roared from launch beds in glittering waves, turning the dark between fleets into rivers of engine fire. Beam batteries lanced outward from artillery barges. Missile clouds unfolded. Kinetic slugs screamed through vacuum, hot enough on discharge to shimmer across sensor boards like newborn suns. It was not battle in the poetic sense. It was execution on a civilizational scale. Asteroids caught in the first wave melted, cracked, or vanished. Smaller debris fields ceased to exist. Sensor boards flooded white. And when the light thinned enough for reality to be seen again, the human fleet was somewhere else. Not gone. Moved. Again. Not miraculously. Not impossibly if one believed enough in preparation, but with the same infuriating precision the patrol had described and the admirals had privately hoped was exaggeration. Ships that should have been cored by saturation fire had slid through gaps between kill cones with fractions of seconds to spare. Entire clusters had dissolved and reformed outside the densest concentrations. A wedge the Confederacy had intended to pin against a gravity shear had become a spiral around it instead, splitting damage probabilities across vectors Vol's tacticians had not modeled in time. Then the humans struck. Not everywhere. That was the first terrifying thing. They did not answer with matching scale. They did not try to overwhelm the entire armada in one dramatic countervolley. They fired at points. Specific points. Carefully chosen points. A carrier coordinating the Eastern Interceptor wing vanished under a triad of needle beams that cut through its relay spine and turned 37 dependent craft into suddenly blind metal. A fuel tender supporting 6 heavy destroyers erupted in silent white fire, forcing all 6 to throttle down within minutes or risk starving their engines in combat space. A communications node anchoring 3 adjacent tactical clusters was pierced so precisely that the ships attached to it did not realize. They were isolated until their updates began arriving contradictory and late. An artillery barge at the rear of the left-center formation took 1 hit through a maintenance gap and lost not its guns, but its targeting matrix, reducing a mountain of steel to blind mass, drifting under irrelevant fire control protocols. On the Resolute Crown, The senior strategist spoke before fear had fully dressed itself in language. They are not engaging the fleet. No one answered, because the next part was becoming clear on the board. They are disassembling it. That was exactly what the humans were doing, not destroying strength indiscriminately, removing coherence. They had looked at the greatest war formation the Confederacy had assembled in generations and treated it not as an enemy to be crushed, but as a structure to be carefully unbuilt. Communication spines, fuel dependencies, coordination nodes, overlapping response chains, logistical choke points, command pathways, redundancy anchors. One by one, the load-bearing elements of imperial warfare were being identified and excised. A lesser species would have seen 2,000 ships and thought wall. The humans had seen architecture, and architecture always dies hardest at its joints. Panic did not begin at the flagship. Panic began in the places where imperial doctrine most depended on confidence being shared faster than confusion. In the isolated clusters whose relay leaders had just vanished. In the wings whose fuel calculations changed mid-attack. In the destroyer packs receiving 3 different orders from 3 different partial networks, each one claiming command authority. In the artillery crews watching targeting updates arrive, already obsolete, because the humans had moved again before the command revisions landed. Then the communications officers reported the truth that finished what discipline had been trying to save. Our encryption is compromised. Val turned so sharply, his cloak twisted around his shoulders. Explain. We are not being jammed, said the officer, voice gone thin with disbelief. They are reading us. That sentence moved through the bridge like cold metal through flesh. Reading, not blocking. Not brute-forcing signals into useless noise. Reading, which meant every repositioning order, every emergency vector, every contingency cluster, every adaptation born in desperation. Known. The Confederacy had entered the rift, carrying its whole battle language inside its own channels, and the humans were already fluent. That was when the asteroid field woke up. For the first half of the engagement, the drifting stone had been scenery. Dangerous scenery, yes, but passive. Broken moons turned slowly around ancient gravity scars, while empires fought among them. Then weapon arrays unfolded from the rock itself. Rail platforms extended from within mineral faces that scanners had tagged as natural mass. Mine dispersal systems rotated out of crater shadows. Torpedo nests opened along asteroid spines with the smooth inevitability of old doors admitting expected guests. Concealed beam emitters, shielded until now by angle and geology and patient engineering, lit all at once from 3 sectors of the field. The battle space changed shape in a single terrible instant. Corridors that had looked like escape routes became kill lanes. Safe vectors became mine webs. Defensive turns became invitations to hidden artillery. The Confederacy had not entered a battlefield. It had entered a machine, and the machine had been built around the expectation that a proud empire would bring exactly this kind of fleet, exactly this kind of command culture, exactly this kind of dependence on centralized coherence. Across the Armada, ships began dying in groups, not whole divisions at once. That would have been easier to understand, easier to narrate back home as overwhelming force met by overwhelming force. No, they died in patterns, the kind that punish faith in systems that a cluster lost its relay, and then its fuel, and then 2 escorts trying to compensate. A carrier group lost launch synchronization, then shielding overlap, then the carrier itself, when it turned to protect a sector the humans had already abandoned. A heavy spear formation pushed hard into what looked like a vulnerable human flank and actually forced, for one brief, hopeful minute, a visible bend in the black line. On a dozen Confederacy bridges, captains saw that bend and felt triumph flare like oxygen finding embers. There. Pressure works. Mass works. They can give ground. They can be made to move. Then the human formation folded around the spearhead, like water closing around a thrown blade. The destroyers at its front were isolated from support by fresh mine blooms. Their rear escorts lost command updates. The attacking wedge found itself suddenly bracketed by converging human fire from 3 elevations, while concealed rift guns cut off retreat vectors behind them. What had looked like a breakthrough was revealed as invitation. The entire spear group vanished in wreckage bright enough to stain the nearby stone with reflected fire. After that, the armada began to die inward, not merely in uncertainty. Captains who had gone into the rift believing they were agents of correction began transmitting with the strangled voices of prey. Order chains lengthened, frayed, contradicted themselves. Bridge crews stopped using the confident tone drilled into military speech and reverted to the older animal language hidden underneath discipline. Faster, higher, rougher, closer to pleading than command. Admiral Val heard it all. He heard formations fail, while still appearing intact on old screens. He heard escorts begging for vectors no one could safely give. He heard damage officers trying to speak calmly over backgrounds full of screaming steel. He heard the moment one of his senior captains finally said, with broken reverence more than fear, "They knew we would come here." Val did not answer that, because by then he knew it too. The patrol had not been a warning ignored by pride. It had been bait swallowed by pride, line and hook, and all the empire behind it. Another blast rocked the resolute crown as a hidden rail strike punched through its outer armor and vented an entire logistics section to vacuum. Lights died along one side of the bridge and returned on emergency blood-red backup. The tactical board, once a beautiful layered expression of imperial mass, had become a wound map. Dead ships, drifting ships, blind ships, ships still firing but no longer into meaning, ships trying to regroup in a geometry the battlefield no longer allowed. The strategist beside him looked not at the battle, but at the pattern underneath it and whispered, "This was built months ago." Yes, of course it was. The torpedo nests in stone, the sensor masking, the carefully leaked traces, the false count, the visible 300, the hidden platforms, the communication compromises, the battle space design that punished exactly the instincts an empire of this shape would bring. Months, perhaps years. The humans had not returned suddenly. They had returned patiently. That was worse. Far worse than rage. Far worse than a remnant species striking wildly from old trauma. This was civilization. Whole. Thinking civilization .1 that had spent its absence not decaying into legend, but sharpening itself against the day reality would need correcting. The order to retreat, when it finally came, did not sound like an admiralty command. It sounded like confession. All remaining clusters, Val said into the imploding command net, disengage on any available path. Withdraw from the rift. Repeat, withdraw immediately. Many did. Many tried. Some succeeded in reaching open vectors only to discover those vectors had already been prepared as channels of controlled survival. The humans allowed escape, but only through routes stripped of advantage and layered with enough selective fire to make the terms unmistakable. Ships that could carry witnesses lived. Ships that still threatened coherence died. The armada stumbled outward as wreckage. Once the proudest military concentration in the known stars, now reduced to isolated hulks, limping escorts, bleeding carriers, command ships with half their systems gone, and every screen full of ghosts where structure had once been. And then, at the threshold where the shattered survivors finally broke free of the tightest geometry of the rift, the humans stopped firing. Completely, the silence that followed was so sudden it hurt. No pursuit, no finishing strike, no ecstatic chase to maximize slaughter. Only stillness. Across the wreckage-choked dark, the remaining human ships drifted back into ordered positions, while the hidden platforms in the stone powered down one by one. The battlefield exhaled. Broken Confederacy vessels kept running, because momentum and terror still commanded them. But behind them, the force that could have annihilated every last survivor simply watched. Then one transmission rolled across every surviving military channel, every damaged bridge, every emergency board, still capable of receiving language. "This is Earth Fleet Command. We can destroy you all. We have chosen not to. Return to your space. Carry this truth with you. Today we showed restraint. Remember that we are capable of the alternative." No signature followed beyond the authority already embedded in the words. No triumph. No threat beyond fact. The surviving captains sat in ruined bridges and felt something no Confederacy officer had ever been trained to feel toward an enemy in the middle of living. Gratitude, not warm gratitude, not relieved gratitude, terrified gratitude. They were alive because the humans had made a deliberate calculation that witnesses served a greater purpose than corpses. That mercy, because it was so measured and so completely under control, landed harder than extermination might have. It meant the humans were not merely stronger. They were disciplined enough to decide, at scale, exactly how much of their strength to reveal. The final campaign fleet limped home as a story the galaxy had no defenses against. Not merely that the Confederacy had lost, not merely that a great armada had been shattered. Worse, that it had been studied, arranged, drawn inward, and taken apart by an enemy so confident in the outcome that it could afford to spare the survivors for political effect. By the time the wrecked remnants crossed back into stable sectors, the old order was already breaking in places maps could not show. Because fleets can be rebuilt, shipyards can burn brighter, weapons can be redesigned. But once an empire's greatest concentration of force has been publicly reduced to witnesses by a civilization out of myth, every subject, watching the retreat, learns the same thing at once. The strong are not permanent, and if the strong are not permanent, then history itself has just opened. The galaxy did not understand what the humans wanted, and in the first months after the Kale Rift, that uncertainty frightened the surviving powers more than the battle itself. War, they understood. War had grammar. It had recognizable shapes, predictable escalations, familiar hungers. Conquest sought territory. Vengeance sought blood. Empires sought tribute, labor routes, legitimacy monuments, and the right to write their own fears into law. Every major civilization across the stars knew how to read those motives, because every major civilization, given sufficient power, had practiced some version of them. But the humans did not move like conquerors. That was the part that would not fit. If they had wanted worlds, they could have taken worlds. The Confederacy's frontier was torn open, its fleets humiliated, its authority bleeding out through every administrative seam. There were trade hubs with defenses too shocked to function, tax worlds with governors already drafting surrender language they hoped would save their skins, and inner-out installations whose commanders slept beside loaded sidearms because their faith in reinforcement timetables had evaporated. A civilization interested in easy expansion could have moved through that weakness like fire through dry grass. The humans did not. They remained patient, present, but patient. They appeared where they chose, struck where they chose, and vanished again without claiming tribute or planting banners or flooding the public channels with theatrical declarations. They let rumor do what fear always does best. They allowed silence to occupy more territory than fleets could. That silence worked on the Confederacy like acid, on worlds that had once bent under tribute without imagining any meaningful alternative. Administrators began encountering hesitation in places where obedience had always been reflex. Orders still went out, but response times lengthened. Resource quotas were still announced, but harvest councils suddenly requested renegotiation instead of immediate compliance. Militia detachments still marched through streets in neat lines, but the civilians watching them no longer looked down automatically. On slave worlds, work gangs started counting guards instead of looking at the ground. On tribute colonies, local councils began meeting after curfew with doors sealed and lights dimmed. On merchant stations, captains quietly asked one another whether Confederacy patrol fees remained worth paying if those patrols could no longer guarantee anything except their own nervousness. Hope spread in uneven, dangerous pulses. It is one thing to hate an empire. It is another to believe that hatred might someday matter. The humans had given the galaxy that second thing. In the old government towers of Zur Prime, the High Chancellor felt it before many others did. She could hear it in the language of her subordinates. Hear how often they now said stability instead of authority, transition instead of permanence, strategic uncertainty instead of control. Institutions betray themselves first through vocabulary. The more often officials reached for softer words, the more clearly she understood that the Confederacy's heart had already accepted what its mouth still resisted. It was over, not instantly, not theatrically. Civilizations that large do not die in a single clean stroke, but over. The old shape might persist for a while, held upright by habit, ceremony, fear, and the sheer inertia of systems built to survive insult. Armies would still march, taxes would still be collected in places, speeches would still be given beneath the Zur banner, reports would still use phrases like restoration operation and unified response posture. Yet all of it would now happen under a truth no decree could erase. The Confederacy was no longer the final horizon of possibility, and once a dominant power loses its monopoly on imagination, decline becomes less a question of if than of how loudly. The envoys were prepared in that atmosphere. It had taken weeks of argument to reach even that point. Some admirals still demanded one more fleet, one more campaign, one more spectacular demonstration of imperial will. Those men were either fools or too committed to the old story to survive outside it. Others argued for internal suppression first, insisting that frontier unrest, labor hesitation, and colonial disorder mattered more than any message sent into the dark. They were not wrong, merely late. The fire had already crossed too much ground for boots alone to stamp it out. The Chancellor listened to all of them, and then chose diplomacy, not because she believed the Confederacy still possessed equal footing at the table, but because only a dying civilization mistakes refusal to speak for strength. So a diplomatic convoy departed Zur Prime under formal truce signatures, and the weight of every remaining institution, the Empire, could still convincingly claim. The lead envoy was Minister Kalanors, an old negotiator with a reputation for composure, so complete that enemies often mistook it for indifference. He had ended border wars with trade concessions no one saw coming, and once kept an assassination attempt from collapsing a sector conference simply by stepping over the dead guard and continuing his sentence without change of tone. He was the kind of man empires send when they need the room itself to feel under control. By the time his convoy reached the outer neutral station chosen for contact, he already knew the room would not belong to him. The station drifted on the edge of the Kale Rift, rebuilt 3 times over a century by commercial interests who cared more about route convenience than symbolism and had now discovered, much too late, that geography acquires meaning whether merchants approve or not. Confederacy security teams swept every corridor. Sensor grids were scrubbed. Formal protocols were reviewed down to gesture angle and seating arrangement. Guards in ceremonial armor took their positions beside banners and gift tables, and the whole familiar theater of diplomacy was assembled with almost painful precision. Then the human representative entered alone, not literally alone. Hidden security might have been everywhere, and only fools mistake visible solitude for real vulnerability. But visibly, unmistakably, alone. No honor guard. No officers at flanking positions. No armor. No jeweled insignia. No floating sigils of state. Just a tall figure in a dark uniform so plain it seemed almost austere beside Confederacy ceremony, the cut practical, the posture effortless, the expression composed without becoming blank. Kalan Ors had spent his life reading power in rooms. He understood hierarchy by the speed at which people blinked, by who sat first, by how long silence could be held before one side rushed to fill it. He had watched kings disguise fear with grandeur and warlords disguise insecurity with volume. He had negotiated across tables built to intimidate and tables built to flatter, and had always, in the end, found the point at which performance gave way to hunger. What stood across from him now did not seem to be performing at all. That was deeply unsettling. The human looked at the prepared gifts, the arranged seating, the polished flags, and then at Ors himself. The gaze carried neither mockery nor approval, only attention, sharp, measured attention, the kind one gives to something that matters without necessarily commanding admiration. Minister, Ors began the formal welcome anyway. Protocol matters most when one side is aware it no longer has the advantage. He delivered the Confederacy's statement in a voice so steady no one listening would have guessed how profoundly the ground had shifted beneath the words. He spoke of mutual recognition, of the need to prevent broader instability, of the importance of establishing frameworks for coexistence between major powers. The human listened without interruption. That made the speech worse. Had they objected, Ors could have sparred. Had they threatened, he could have measured threat against policy. Had they shown hunger for concession, he could have negotiated. Instead, when he finished, the human asked only, "Have you come to understand, or to preserve what can no longer be preserved?" The question landed so cleanly it made the room feel suddenly smaller. Ors had answers prepared for aggression, disdain, territorial demand, even moral accusation. He had not prepared for accuracy. He set his hands lightly on the edge of the table and chose honesty with the care of a man selecting a blade he may need to survive his own truth. "I have come," he said, "to understand what it is that you want." The human was silent for a moment, not theatrical silence, not the kind used to dominate, the kind used by someone deciding how much truth another civilization is ready to hear without turning away from it. "At one time," the human said, "the galaxy knew us." The voice was calm, quiet enough that everyone in the chamber leaned inward without meaning to. It knew where we were. It knew what we built. It knew what happened when power was left unanswered for too long. Then we were buried, forgotten in records, laughed out of history, reduced to mythology because mythology was more comfortable than memory. Ors did not move. "We did not return for conquest," the human continued. "We did not return to replace the Confederacy with another empire, wearing different language and a different flag. We returned because history was denied, because cruelty had hardened into structure, and because across this galaxy too many people were told their suffering was simply the shape of reality." The minister's pulse had become unpleasantly audible in his own ears. This was not how empires spoke. Empires speak of necessity, not of security, not of destiny, not of burdens they alone are strong enough to bear. Even benevolent empires speak that way eventually. Once scale convinces them their preferences are principles. But this was something else. "What you want," Ors said carefully, "is change." The human's eyes did not leave his. Yes, it should not have been a frightening answer. It was because change, spoken plainly by a civilization capable of shattering fleets and dismantling centuries of hierarchy, was more destabilizing than any demand for tribute could ever have been. Tribute can be priced. Territory can be mapped. Surrender can be signed. Change enters systems at the level of meaning, and if the galaxy resists, Ors asked, a pause, then the galaxy will learn which of its structures deserve to survive. No one in the room mistook that for a threat. It was worse than a threat. It was policy. When the meeting ended, Ors bowed, not because protocol required it. Confederacy protocol required many things, and that was not one of them. He bowed because the old instincts of rank and civilization had failed to offer him a more honest gesture. The human returned the bow with minimal motion. Then they left. That image spread through the stars almost as quickly as the battle reports had. Not the full transcript at first. Power still tries to throttle truth while deciding whether it can use it. But enough leaked. Enough always leaks. Enough for worlds and factions and oppressed peoples and rival states to understand the shape of what had entered history. The humans were not here to sit in the old throne. They were here to break the throne and ask what should exist after it. That question frightened the remaining old powers more than any armada. The Celt Dominion, which had survived a century through careful compromise, began reopening treaties it had never dared challenge. The Vey Republic suspended transit tribute, pending new strategic realities. The Free Guilds, loyal only to leverage, launched a dozen independent intelligence operations trying to determine how quickly association with the Terran Union, as the humans now publicly named themselves, might become more profitable than neutrality. That on frontier worlds, local councils, who had once hidden dissent under fear, started drafting letters of alignment, protection requests, mutual development offers, and in some cases, simple one-line declarations. We choose the new order. Not every world moved at once. Some hesitated, some bargained, some tried to wait and see whether the humans could truly maintain what they had begun. But the movement was unmistakable, and the humans did not answer it with annexation fleets. They answered it case by case, with the same precision they had shown. In battle, on the mining world of Hethra, where 2 generations had lived and died under labor quotas, so severe the official term worker had become a joke told only in bitterness, human ships appeared in orbit without firing a shot. They disabled the processing station's enforcement grid, opened the compounds, and broadcast one message in every local language. This ends now. Leave if you wish. Stay if you choose. No one will compel either decision. Tens of thousands left. The station managers, stripped of power so fast they had not even finished drafting their formal protest, could do nothing but watch populations they had treated as function walk calmly out from under them and into transport corridors lit by human security teams who neither shouted nor celebrated. On the old trade lanes, patrol vessels famous for extortion began disappearing, not destroyed, but neutralized, disarmed, and left adrift with drives dead and evidence records intact. Merchant convoys, once forced to bleed profit at every checkpoint passed through under silent human escort, and, for the first time in memory, paid no bribes to remain unmolested. That on 3 worlds where Confederacy governors had been conducting systematic cultural erasure under the soothing language of integration policy, small Terran teams arrived with no fleet fanfare at all. They removed the governors, dismantled the programs, restored confiscated archives, and left before most of the galaxy had even processed what had occurred. Every action sent the same message in a different form. The humans were not expanding randomly. They were correcting, methodically, selectively, with enough force to make resistance meaningless and enough restraint to make motive impossible to dismiss. In the final sessions of the High Council, the High Chancellor stopped speaking of imperial restoration entirely. Too many members had already resigned, disappeared, or shifted allegiance with the furtive speed of officials who suddenly discover that survival and loyalty are not the same virtue. She spoke instead of transition, continuity of civilian life, protection of populations, administrative transfer. Her admirals heard surrender in those words and hated her for it. Her governors heard realism and were quietly grateful. History would judge her more generously than either group. In the end, she asked for only one thing during the negotiated dissolution: that the people of the Confederacy not be punished for the structure into which they had been born. When the Terran representatives agreed, without hesitation, some of the old ministers wept in private for reasons they could not easily explain. Perhaps because mercy always lands hardest on those who expected revenge. Perhaps because they were seeing, for the first time, a civilization powerful enough to choose not to reproduce the logic of domination. Perhaps because old age had finally given them the distance to understand that fear had governed more of history than strength ever truly had. The Confederacy did not vanish in one night. Its outer provinces split first, then its middle territories, then its core sectors negotiated themselves into new federations, autonomous blocks, mutual defense compacts, trade unions, and provisional governments under Terran protection or observation. Zur Prime remained symbolically central, even as real authority bled from it day by day. Its streets filled with people who had once lowered their voices when discussing the future, and now argued about it openly beneath the same towers that had once cast certainty over all of them. Elsewhere, not everyone accepted the change. There were old powers still clinging to the belief that what had happened could be reversed by coalition, by secret weapons, by patience, by finding the seam in Terran discipline and driving a blade into it hard enough. In deep chambers far from public systems, rulers and admirals and industrial magnates gathered over hidden maps and whispered the same tired sentence pride always produces when reality becomes intolerable. Nothing is unbeatable. They were right, but they still did not understand the real problem. The strength of the Terran Union was not only in fleets, though its fleets were terrible, not only in discipline, though its discipline had shattered empires, not only in strategy, though its strategy had turned entire armadas into witness statements. Its deepest strength was that it had returned carrying an idea more durable than fear, that the order of the galaxy was not fixed, that power did not sanctify cruelty, that history could be remembered and altered by those willing to bear the cost of altering it, that there existed, somewhere beyond the old logic of empire, a civilization willing to use force not as permission to dominate, but as a tool to stop domination from calling itself natural. Ideas like that spread in ways governments cannot fully police. They spread when children on frontier worlds press their faces to observation glass and watch human ships cross the sky and feel excitement instead of dread. They spread when old laborers on broken colonies look upward and remember what expectation felt like before life taught them to bury it. They spread when rulers reading intelligence reports discover that they can calculate fleet ratios, ammunition output, trade exposure, alliance probability, and still cannot model what happens when whole. Populations stop believing suffering is inevitable. Admiral Elias Ward, commander of the Terran Outer Fleet, stood one cycle later on the bridge of his flagship and watched new patrol vectors unfold across a star map no empire would ever fully own again. Around him, his crew moved with the same quiet precision that had once terrified the Confederacy. They had not celebrated after the Kale Rift. They had not celebrated during the dismantling of the old order. They worked, planned, adjusted, built, freed, guarded, prepared, always prepared, because they understood something the empires never had. No victory worth having remains victory by inertia. He looked through the forward glass at the stars, cold and ancient and uninterested in the names civilizations carved across them, and spoke not as a conqueror addressing subjects, but as a witness to history finally remembering itself. The galaxy thought we were stories, he said. No one interrupted. It laughed because laughter was easier than asking why we vanished. It called us myth because myth is safer than memory. It mistook our absence for extinction and its own power for permanence. He let that settle. Then he turned toward the crew. They expected conquerors, he said. They expected another empire, another banner, another hand closing around the throat of the stars. What they got was something they don't have a word for yet. A faint smile touched one corner of his mouth. Not warm, not cruel, simply certain. Let them struggle for the word. His officers did not cheer. They never did. Their stillness was older than celebration, rooted in purpose too deep to need outward display. Beyond the flagship, the fleet began to move, not toward one world, not toward one war, outward, into the places where old violence still hid beneath legal language, into the lanes where extortion still called itself order, into the systems where frightened rulers still believed the dark would protect them from consequence, into the fragile new spaces where hope had begun to grow and needed, for a little while longer, something stronger than hope standing beside it. The stars burned on above all of it, as they had above every empire that had ever imagined itself immortal. But beneath them the galaxy was changing, slowly, painfully, imperfectly, not into paradise, not into peace without cost that civilization earns that so easily, but into something different. And different, after ages ruled by fear mistaken for law, was more dangerous than any weapon the old powers had ever faced. The myths had returned. They were real. They had always been real. And now, at last, so it was the future they carried with them.